Welcome to the VIP Exchange, Champions in the Chaos, with Steven Iwersen, a program for people who want to turn the chaos of business and life into positive outcomes and forward momentum.
Welcome to VIP Exchange, Champions in the Chaos, and I want to welcome our guest today, Steven Tweed. Steven, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Steven. Two Stevens in the same room, it's got to be good, right?
That's right. But you're pH balanced and I'm not.
That's correct. That's correct.
So, but we'll get through it all, I'm sure.
Sounds good.
Well, I am delighted that you've joined me today, and we're going to find out in a moment why specifically I was wanting you to join us. But I thought maybe for those of our listeners and viewers who aren't aware of who Steven Tweed is, you get a chance to just give a little brief on who you are, what your industry is, and the people you serve.
Well, thank you, Steven. Our company is Leading Home Care, a Tweed Jeffries company. And what I've been really working on in the last 5 to 7 years is what we call the Home Care CEO Forum. Our niche is the home healthcare industry, which is made up of home health, hospice, and a third sector just called home care. It's sometimes referred to as private duty home care or in-home personal care. And in the last 5 years, that's the sector that I've narrowed in my focus. And these are privately held companies, rather small for the most part, that provide personal caregivers in the home for seniors who want to remain as independent as possible and to remain in their own homes. Mm-hmm. And it's probably the fastest growing segment of healthcare in America, but it flies under the radar. One, because it's not connected to doctors and hospitals, and two, because it's mostly private pay, although some state Medicaid programs also provide in-home personal care. Mm-hmm. And so in 2012, we introduced the mastermind concept, and you and I know about the mastermind concept from our National Speakers Association. And my wife, Elizabeth, who you know well and is my business partner, and I have been in a number of mastermind groups over the years with other professional speakers. And so we introduced the concept to the home care industry. We started our first group of CEOs in 2013. And today we have 6 groups with about 48 companies that meet twice a year face-to-face and once a month by Zoom video to share ideas, to solve problems, to support one another. And all of that discussion has led to identifying the number one big burning issue that these members face, which is the caregiver recruiting and retention crisis. Right. And so we've been doing a lot of research the last 10 years, but particularly the last 4 or 5 years, on how do we create the kind of company that will attract and retain the kind of people that we need to give care to these seniors in their homes. So that's the short version of what we're doing.
And an exciting adventure. Now, here's the book that you wrote a few years ago, Conquering the Crisis, and it's very specific to your industry. But as I read through it, I found tremendous insights that I think apply to everyone. And the crisis that you mentioned here is the one you just alluded to, and that was the recruitment and retention of really excellent caregivers. I'm imagining that a lot of business leaders who are listening to us right now are thinking, well, we've got that problem too, especially with the COVID protocols and everything that's hit. And of course, it's been in the news that people are really struggling to find good help. How has COVID-19 affected the crisis for the leaders in your masterminds? Yeah.
Well, it's exacerbated the problem. The problem is not new. It's been around for a decade. We actually started doing research on this back in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, and introduced a product in 2006. So we've been working on this for a long time. With COVID, obviously, people were staying home, locked down. Before the vaccines, people were very cautious. Senior living communities were locked down. Mm-hmm. Our members, our home care people, saw their businesses increase, and particularly if they were prepared to care for their clients who had tested COVID positive, their businesses just exploded. But caregivers were not working either because they were concerned about being exposed, or they had young children in no daycare and schools were closed. So there were lots of issues during that first half a year. It started, actually, I was with one of my mastermind groups in Austin, Texas on March the 12th, 2020. And that company had to shut down because they had an exposure, and we went back to our hotel and continued our meeting. And that was sort of the beginning of COVID for us. Mm-hmm. And so the next 6 months, there was a lot of turmoil, but our members kept busy. Unlike a lot of our colleagues in the speaking business, their calendars evaporated almost overnight. We stayed pretty busy. We did away with our face-to-face meetings, but we continued to do Zoom. And I had been introduced to Zoom 5 years earlier by one of our clients. And so we were doing Zoom meetings every month prior to this. So we barely missed a blip in our radar because we kept going, unlike so many other businesses and so many other companies.
Right.
The caregiver crisis became exacerbated with the combination of COVID and then all the COVID relief bills and the supplemental income and the unemployment compensation and all of those issues made it much more complicated until April of this year. We described what we called the perfect storm, when there were 3 different economic stimulus packages that hit all at once, and people just said, I don't need to go to work. I've got money in my checkbook. So it's been a real challenging year. 2021 has actually been more difficult for our members than 2020.
Okay. Yeah. And I found that to be true in my business as well. 2020 was actually very strong because most of our clients shifted to virtual.
Yeah.
And then 21 was this really delicate dance of, do we do virtual? Do we do live? Do we do a combination? And so everything was very fluid. 2022 is looking better. I'm curious, of the top 5% that are in your programs, what do you think they're doing, or how are they preparing to lead the way for 2022?
Well, that's a great question, because that particular group, the top 5% group, is our largest mastermind group in terms of the size of their companies. And the percent represents their percentile in the industry by revenue. And actually, we could call this group the top 3% because our members are at that level in the industry. And we have some industry benchmarking data on which we base that. And so our companies experienced sort of a flat year in 2021 because of this caregiver crisis. And I had a lot of members saying, if I could get the caregivers, I could double my business, but I can't get the caregiver. So now they have figured, I won't say they figured it out, but they've developed systems that are working better than their competition. Mm. And so they're able to create a great place to work and attract the best workers. And so they're able to grow their business. They've put some systems in place, some operational efficiencies, some other kinds of things. And so they have sort of learned from the experience and from their colleagues in the mastermind group. And so they're projecting 15% growth in 2022, which is higher than the industry average has been the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, that's outstanding. You wrote in the book, the Conquering the Crisis, that part of the strategy of really attracting the best candidates and the best caregivers was to make sure that they focused on culture, mm-hmm. which is, for me, the heart of any organization. And you defined culture as an essential part of conquering this crisis, and also outstanding research and the data to help people understand how important it is that you have systems to support that. Let's talk for a few minutes about how you personally define a positive, strong culture.
Okay. Well, we define culture as the way we do things around here. It's that simple. So every company has a culture,
Mm-hmm.
The question is it defined and is it intentional? Is it on purpose, or is it by happenstance because this is the way we do things? And so the way we do things around here is influenced by four big factors. The first one is the leadership style of the CEO. And so if the CEO has a commitment to people and creating a great place to work and hiring great people and to the core values and principles and character, then you have a company that's on its way to building a strong culture. If not, all the CEO cares about is the bottom line dollars, then you have a culture, but it's a different culture.
Right.
So it starts with the CEO. And the second big factor then are the core values that guide your thoughts and your actions and your decisions. And so whether the CEO, the founder of the company, brings those core beliefs, or whether as a leadership team we define them, it's about defining the core values. And in researching this and studying, and I wrote about it in the book, we've got to get that down to 3. People say, well, why 3? We've got 7, and these are all really 7 important things. Well, the reason you have 3 is because people can't remember more than 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I was speaking for a large home care company in Vancouver, British Columbia, about a decade ago. And the founder had really worked on crafting the culture. And I interviewed him before I presented to their group. And then a week later, we were both presenting at the same conference for the National Association for Home Care and conference here in the US. And he came down and he gave his presentation. He was talking about their culture and about the importance of having only 3 core values. You could have 4, but he said, people won't remember. If you don't believe me, test it out. And so I did that. I went to some people that I had worked with and said, remember we did the work on values and you had 7. Could you tell me your core values? And invariably they got to 3. Maybe they could remember the 4th one. Almost nobody could remember the 5th one. And so it's like, well, if you can't remember them, what's the point in having them on the piece of paper or on the plaque on the wall?
Right.
And so you get it down to the 3 core behavior or core values, and then you define the behavior. So the next of the 4 elements, the third element is the behavior you expect. And so we take the core values and we define the behaviors that go with that. And we limit it to 5. Again, people can't remember more than 3 or 4, but we gave in and said, okay, you can have 5, and we write them down. And then the 4th element is the behavior you permit. And you might know my wife, Elizabeth, and she coaches executives and she coaches physician leaders in academic medicine. And her mantra is the behavior you permit, you promote. And so as leaders developing your culture, you not only have to define what are the values that guide our decisions, what are the behaviors that we demonstrate when we're living those values, but what are the consequences for people whose behavior is outside of the expectation. And that's the hardest part for many organizations.
Right.
But that's what leads to the strong culture. And some of that goes back to the principle of accountability, that leaders in the team are willing to hold each other accountable for living the behaviors.
Right.
They're willing to hold their organizations accountable. And they're willing to be accountable when somebody down the organization comes up and says, hey, wait a minute, here's the values, but you're not living that.
Right.
And so that becomes the hard part. And in the book and in my work, I often quote my colleague and friend, Mark Bayada at Bayada Home Healthcare in New Jersey. Mark has spent 40 years crafting the culture. And he started as a very small in-home personal care company in downtown Philadelphia in 1975. And he's grown it into the world's largest family-owned, privately held home healthcare company. And he spent 40 years working on the culture. And I use that example because it's a classic example of a great company that's built a strong culture, but it's also publicly available. So if you want to read about the Bayada way, you can go to their website, Bayada, BAYADA.com, and there's a button that says the Buy Out Away, and you can click on it, and it lays out the values and the behaviors and the elements of their culture. And so it's a good example for anybody who wants to study crafting the culture. It's only one example, but it's a great company with a great culture that does good work for seniors in their homes. And so that's an example that I use.
I love the idea that he has not only helped to define what the culture should be for the organization, but you use the phrase crafting it for 40 years. So it's not a one-time retreat, here's our stuff, posted on the wall, but it's 40 years of hard work.
That's right.
That's helped that organization to become one of the leaders in the industry. How does a leader stay on top of crafting the culture when there's so many moving parts of leadership? What are your recommendations with that?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to the leadership style. And here was a leader who intuitively understood that to grow a successful, profitable company, it had to be done with a certain set of core values, a certain character, a certain level of integrity. Mm-hmm. And he had a friend, colleague, advisor who helped him with that over the years. And they just continue to work at it. And part of it is repetition and consistency. And I apologize, I don't have it here with me, but there's a picture of it in the book. Mark passes out a plasticized folder the size of a business card, and it's a 4-fold folder. Mm-hmm. And on the front, it says the Buy Out Away, and then it has their mission and their vision. And on the back, it has, on the 3 panels, the 3 core values, a definition, and the behaviors that go with that. And he passes those out by the bazillions. To anybody who will listen, he passes that out. And so it's a physical manifestation with the words on paper that articulate the beliefs. Mm-hmm. And that then carries out into everything that they do. Mm-hmm. And I took one of my mastermind groups to their global support center in Morristown, New Jersey, a year or so ago. And we walked in, and there's a whole wall with a timeline of the company and key points around the development of the company culture. And then we go into one of their meeting rooms, and there's 3 core values. There's excellence, there's compassion, I've forgotten the third one. And each room is labeled. So there's the excellence room, and there's the compassion room on the front of the door. So they're almost carrying the visualization of the principles to an extreme.
Yes.
But believe me, nobody will forget.
Right.
And it's that kind of commitment. The core values and the culture have led them then to some fundamental principles about how they have grown their business, their strategy for growth. And so they have focused on some core service lines. They're now up to 9 service lines, but they started with 1. And they have some core principles around growth and around net profit expectations. And so it's not all warm, fuzzy, touchy-feely. They have some very serious business objectives and strategies. And it's not explosive growth, and it's not just about the bottom line, but that's steady growth and a reasonable bottom line are part of their way of doing business.
Right. And
that's paid into growing a company that the last time I had this conversation with Mark was $1.5 billion. That's billion with a B.
Yeah.
And privately owned, family held, very interesting model. And as you know, Stephen, there's lots of other companies out there, some publicly traded, some privately held, some not-for-profit organizations that have built strong cultures. And so there are a number of examples to look at.
There are, yeah. So as I'm hearing, the core values become manifested in definition, mm-hmm. Become the tool in which to make good decisions.
Yes.
That then executes the behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So I'm thinking some of our listeners who are looking at us going, well, I don't have $1 billion business, and I'm just happy to have a full calendar for the next year. Core values still could be very beneficial to them because it will help to clarify how to make better decisions moving forward.
Exactly. And my wife and business partner, Elizabeth Jeffries, and when Elizabeth and I put our two businesses together, about 5 years after we married, we decided we would put our companies together. And we sat down and did some visioning. What do we want our life to look like 10 years from now? And what do we want our business to look like to support our lifestyle? And we sat down and had a conversation about what are the core values. And we came up with 4 of them: reliability, responsiveness, respect, and results. And we defined that, saying reliability is, we do what we said we will do. And responsiveness is we answer the phone before the third ring and we get back to people within 24 hours. And those are examples of the kinds of behaviors.
Right.
Results, we believe that we need to get results for our clients, and that if people do what we suggest, whether it's through a keynote speech or a workshop or a strategy session, if they apply those principles, they will get outcomes. And so when you have your own core values and the definitions and some of the behaviors that go with that, if you're a solo practitioner, professional speaker, or consultant or coach, you can still use those same principles to guide your decisions growing your business. Good. And then when you start adding people, and even as a solo practitioner, we often have some support staff or some subcontractors that as we communicate those values and expectations, it carries forward then in how our team members treat our clients and our sponsors and other stakeholders that we may have.
Right. So I want to go back to the leader. What I read from your book, and I took away, just excited me because I've seen it in a lot of clients that I've worked with. The leader who not just helps to define and shape vision, mission, the core values, the actual words, but actually lives it out.
Yes.
In their own behaviors, is the one who really helps to champion that culture throughout the organization. But the one who is all words, but really not in practice.
Yes.
How have you seen that? And I know you've seen it. Have you seen that impact some of the organizations that are in your industry?
Well, we talked to some middle managers who are working in big organizations, and when you have this conversation, they say, "Well, the problem I have is that we have the values and we have the behaviors and we have the plaque on the wall, and this is what we say, but then we look at the leaders and what they do is not consistent with what they say, and it undermines credibility and it undermines the real culture of the organization." And so the real culture is something else that's behind, and the words on paper are sort of the facade that we're putting up there to paint the picture, but behind it is something else, versus the true leader who really believes in these values and their character is reflected in the values, and then they live it out.
Right. And
then they build it into everything they do. So, for example, in our caregiver quality assurance program, we're working on the caregiver quality selection system, and we're looking at the process of interviewing. And in our industry, a lot of the interviews have been around previous work experience and job skills. We introduced the culture fit interview, where you take your 3 core values and the behaviors, and you identify some behavioral interview questions where you get applicants to talk about. So let's use compassion as a core value. Well, here's what we mean by compassion. Tell me what compassion means to you. Give me an example of when you have demonstrated compassion in the workplace. And you build that into your selection system so that you're hiring people whose personal values and personal integrity and work ethic is in alignment. And it's not always ever going to be perfect, but it's in alignment. And of course, we always say hire for attitude, train for skills. In this case, we're hiring for values. Yeah. And in most industries, you can teach people the knowledge and skills they need to do the job if they bring the right work ethic and the right attitude and a desire to learn and grow.
Right. Right.
And if we can bring in people who desire to learn and grow, then we can figure it out going forward, and we can build, a significant organization, not because we have all the answers, but we have a group of people who share some common values and a common vision and want to work together to figure out how to get there.
Right. I find it fascinating that the communication of the values guiding that organization are actually being communicated in the interview process.
Yes.
Before the onboarding has even begun. So
That's
you're
right.
really setting the standard right up front. And I would imagine that when an organization is really living by those values and it's attracting the kind of people who have an affinity to those values, the branding, in a sense, of what that organization represents becomes a great tool for recruiting more like those folks that are making the real thing happen.
Oh, absolutely. Not only are you creating a great place to work once you get into the organization, but as you said, the employment brand that's out there is built around how we communicate our values and the behaviors and the culture. And word gets around, boy, this is a great place to work. And so you have more high quality applicants, and then you have the opportunity to be selective in picking the very best people whose values are in alignment with the culture of the company. And you can attract people that also bring, technical skills to the job as well as their beliefs and values.
Right. Wow. So I think what we've learned is that a solopreneur to a leader leading a multi-billion-dollar operation, the core of it all really is the heart, and how are you defining the right behaviors, the directions, all of those things. And I was just thinking a moment ago when you're talking about the leaders, the behavior you permit. When I read that, I remember immediately thinking about the behavior I permit with my staff, with the people who are on the front lines doing the work that we're needing to get done. But all of a sudden, my brain just made this big shift and realized the behavior I permit also applies to the people at the top who are supposed to be the executives leading the way. It permeates the entire organization, not just one level or another.
That's right.
Wow.
And it's the, do as I do, not as I say kind of thing, or do as I say, not as I do. It's when what we say and what we do are in alignment.
Yeah.
And they're in alignment with the core values and the culture of the company, then we have that high level of integrity. But if we have leaders at the top who are looking down saying, do as I say, not as I do, obviously people see through that very quickly.
Right.
With Sunday night football, we've taught people to be great spectators. And so people in organizations are spectating, they're watching their leaders and how they behave and what they say and what they do. And they can sort out the folks who are really living their values versus those who are painting a positive picture, but not really living or believing what they're painting.
Right. Wow. I know somebody's going to be listening to this and they're going to be thinking, I work in a company that has 7, 9, 12 values. How in the world do you help people get it down to the 3 or 4?
That's the really hard part. If they've already got an organization that's gone through a process and they've developed a list of 7 values, what I have done in a couple of organizations is when we've had this conversation is get them to go back and look at all 7 again, and then to do some ranking.
Yes.
Sometimes it's a more in-depth comparison, comparing each one of the others, and get the top 3, and then be willing to say, yes, these other are important, but not as important. And if people can't remember them, it doesn't matter. Let's focus on the top three and build from there. And what I invariably find is that the underlying principles behind those other four get incorporated into how we live out our culture. And we don't lose them, they don't go away. They're just not articulated in the document because we want people to remember and to focus. And if we can get people to focus on three core values and the behaviors and to begin to craft that culture, these other things that we thought were important values they still show up in how we live our lives.
I was wondering if that might happen, that somehow they begin to transfer into the definitions of how we behave in the three. Yes. And they still live themselves out in that because they were important in the first place.
And the tricky part is not letting the group, when I'm leading this process, is not letting the group dilute the definitions by trying to weave those other words in there. And so what I say to them is, no, be true. If excellence is one of your core values, let's focus on the definition of excellence and what it means and what are the behaviors that we see in our organization. And don't worry about this one that was down the list, honesty. And if that's not one of the top three, it's like, don't try to weave honesty into excellence, but accept that if you have excellence and compassion and inclusiveness, that by defining those and living those, these other things that you said were important will be naturally inculcated into the culture of the organization.
Right.
And if they aren't, maybe they weren't that important after all.
I wasn't going to go there, but maybe they weren't. Wow. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the conversation about culture because I think what I've learned in this conversation is that it's more than just an exercise at a retreat of coming up with the nice verbiage of what we want to be known for, but it's really, it's the practice of, it's the being of those things that really shapes the culture, and having the discussion about how we define those behaviors is really as vital as just coming up with the one word that defines our core.
Right, right.
Wow. Well, this has been a fabulous dialogue, and I appreciate it. Before we kind of wrap things up, I'd like to know, how can people best get a hold of you if they'd like to get more information?
Our website is leadinghomecare.com, LEADING, homecare.com. You can go there and you can find us. My email is Steven with a PH at leadinghomecare.com, and always happy to have conversation and engage folks. This is always a meaningful discussion. So if anybody wants to talk about it, ask questions, explore it, look for some other resources, happy to have some discussion.
Very good. Very good. And ladies and gentlemen, even though my business is not in the area of caregiver recruiting, the insights I gained from Steven's book really made me realize that there were some things I needed to fine-tune in my own business. And I want to encourage you to think about getting a copy of his book as well, because the insights, even though they're very specific to his industry, they still are very transferable to all leadership and cultural issues. Well, Steven, thanks again. But before we wrap it up, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share some final words of encouragement for our listeners.
Well, you started off talking about COVID, Steven, and the impact. And a year into the COVID thing, I was really doing some reflection about what I was experiencing and what I was seeing. And we're in a group of other speakers that share some insights on a regular basis. And one of our leaders who asked us to define our word for the year. And we've done this every year for the last 5 or 6 years. And so for 2020, it was not one word, but three words. It was gratitude, generosity, and grace. Be thankful for what we have because of all the challenges going around us. Be generous to people. And when things were really crunching during COVID and restaurants were shut down, we went out of our way to do some things. And then grace. Give people grace when they're behaving in ways that make us uncomfortable because they're doing the best they can do, or they do something different. Yeah. And I think particularly in this holiday season in 2021, with the workforce shortages and all of those issues, there are lots of times when we get maybe a little uncomfortable with the level of service we're receiving. And I'm saying, give these folks grace. And I've made a point to thanking people for coming to work today because so many people did not. Right. And so that's one little thing that I'm doing. And so I guess my word for our listeners is, what are your core values and how can you make a conscious choice to take one of those or a couple of those and live it out by being generous, by showing grace, by being kind to people. And that's sort of what we're doing, and building our own little culture around us as we go through life, because we've been blessed beyond imagination to be in this business of speaking and consulting and coaching, and for me to be in the home care industry, working with companies taking care of seniors and taking care of their caregivers. And so we're just in gratitude and in generosity and grace.
Wonderful. Wonderful words of counsel and advice. And I want to thank you, not just for the time that we've shared, but for the years that we have known each other and been friends, and for the counsel you've provided in the past. And I'm looking forward to many more as they come along. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll look forward to it. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.